This morning, turn to Matthew chapter 2. We're going to read Matthew chapter 2. We're going to start with verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and have come to worship him. When Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea. For this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For from you will come forth a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called for the Magi, and determined from them the exact time that the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. And after hearing the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went on ahead of them until it came to stop over the place where the child was to be found. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after being warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Now, when we see Christmas cards, we see three wise men usually on campus. And we see them at the manger. And to be fair, it's hard to include everything. You know, Luke says the birth of Christ was like this. He starts out the story. The birth of Christ was on this wise. Matthew says after Jesus was born, this happened. It's kind of hard to fit that in a whole story, right? It's hard to tell your kids, well, this year we're going to have the nativity with the shepherds. Next year it's going to be a house of wise men. You know, we combine the whole story, and it's not heretical to say, okay, if you have a Christmas card with shepherds and wise men together, okay. But that is an artist's rendition trying to fit all the stories together. Those are artist renditions trying to fit everything that happened around the birth of Christ in at the same time. But that's not how it really happened. There's a reason that the Magi were only listed in Matthew. Matthew was written to the Jews. Matthew, all of the apologetics in Matthew are setting Jesus up as king. They're setting him up as king of Israel, setting him up as the king of kings. They're establishing Jesus' lordship, his lineage. Matthew mentions the lineage of Joseph from David, actually all the way back from Abraham. And it established his royal lineage and rights to the throne of David. That's what Matthew talks about. When he talks about the Magi coming for a coronation of the king, he would include that. Number one, the local Jews would have known the story. Number two, the Romans, the Gentiles, like the churches that Luke and Mark were written to, they wouldn't have known that story. They wouldn't have known the prophecies of Bethlehem. They were the Gentiles. They would not have known that, and it would not have mattered to them. So the Gospel of Matthew is specific. So we need to ask three questions in order to understand why it was important to the story. First, get my notes on. Who were the Magi? How did they know about Jesus? And why did they come? Those are the three questions that we need to ask. First of all, who are the Magi? The word Magi is the name of an ancient priestly tribe. They were from the Chaldeans back from the time of Abraham. They are like nothing that we have on record today. Because when we think wise men, we think, advisors to the king. But they were also referred to as magicians. So we've got, magicians, maybe sorcerers, maybe Merlin comes to mind, or some kind of druidic image of a guy in a robe with a conical hat and, all this crazy stuff. You've got these magical images, or were they scientists, astrologers, alchemists? What were they? The answer is yes. The Magi were a tribe, and they were a priestly tribe that came from the ancient area of the Fertile Crescent, and they were masters of science, religion, math, astronomy. They eventually got into politics and law because they were brought into the kings and the rulers as advisors, as fortune tellers, as someone who could read the stars, someone who could interpret dreams. They put a lot of stock in interpreting dreams. That's why when God appeared to the Magi, he appeared to them in a dream. None of them woke up and go, dude, the weirdest thing happened last night. God appeared to me in a dream. Who? What? What? No, that's what they lived for. These guys lived for prophetic dreams and interpreting, dreams and everything. That they lived for that kind of thing. And that's what they were masters in. They were called wise men. They were magicians. In fact, the word magic comes from the word magi. They were the ancient mystics. They studied both astronomy and astrology, mixing science and religion. There are very few people that do that. The president isn't going to call somebody to his cabinet because he can pull a rabbit out of a hat. The magicians are one thing, scientists, politics. These guys were a combination of all of these things. The early Magian system was decreed to be the state religion of Media by the king of the Medes in the late 6th century. After some of the Magi, who were considered to be expert in the interpretation of dreams, and they had been attached to the Median court. It was in this dual capacity that civil and political council was invested with religious authority. And that's where the Magi really established themselves. They were religious priests. They were also schooled in science. They were also schooled in politics and law. All of these writings together, they compiled the wisdom of the Magi and called it the law of the Medes and the Persians. Remember that? From Esther and from Daniel, the law of the Medes and the Persians were all of the wisdom of the Magi in a curriculum form, basically, in a written form. So when Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were taken captive, brought over into Babylon, and said they had to study the ways of Babylon, they would have had to study the laws of the Medes and the Persians. Because that's what the princes and the advisors had to do. They were the kingmakers. Magi were the kingmakers. Nobody could become a king in the Middle East without the approval of the Magi. And just like any other prince would be sent to study school, higher education, and also the laws of the land, a prince would want to be schooled in that. The Persian and Babylonian princes would be schooled by the Magi themselves. And they would not be approved as king until the Magi said, okay, you're it. We approve of you. You pass the test. They could also remove a king. So kings were scared of them. When the Magi showed up, kings were scared to death. Even Nero, as awful and arrogant as that guy was and completely crazy as he was, Magi showed up in Rome and they said he quaked in his sandals. Nero was scared to death of the Magi because they were that powerful. They could have walked in and undermined his authority with just a word. That's who the Magi were. These guys, they were kingmakers. They kept the checks and balances. They were like the Senate and the Supreme Court together. They were the one that kept the king from having ultimate despotic power. The word magistrate, the root word of magistrate is magi. So they were knowledgeable of law and worked in that as well. No one ruled apart from their approval, and if they didn't have their approval, they could remove it. That's who the Magi were. They weren't just three dudes on camels. They were powerful. When they traveled with a huge entourage, a huge caravan. Yeah, how many here have seen any version of Aladdin? The cartoon, the new Will Smith version. Okay. Remember the scene where he first introduces Aladdin as Prince Ali, handsome as he, and they had this huge procession coming in. When the Magi traveled, that's how they traveled. Possibly 1,000 or more people in their entourage. Because when you're moving across, you have to have soldiers. You have to carry flocks with you so you have something to eat. You have chefs, you have tradesmen, craftsmen, doctors. When they traveled, there were possibly 1,000 of them in this entourage, and it is not unrealistic to say that Prince Ali scene when they came in to the city of, was it Agrabah or something? I can't remember what the... Okay. I need a Arabian expert there. Thank you. The entourage was huge. It wasn't just three dudes in camels. That's who they were. So how could these ancient priestly kingmakers have known about Christ? How did they know about that there was a baby born? Well, let's look back in Daniel. Daniel was kidnapped or taken captive when Nebuchadnezzar came to Israel, took away captives from Judah. He took the choice princes and the most knowledgeable people, the royalty, and he brought them in to be re-educated in his court. And through a series of events, Daniel and his three buddies rose to prominence. Well, you remember the story of the king's dream. Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and he called in all the Magi and said, listen, I want you guys to interpret my dream. They're like, great, that's what we do, man. Your Highness, that's what we do. We interpret dreams. Now, you tell me what your dream is, and we'll give it to you. He's like, well, that's the problem. I can't remember it. You tell me what my dream is, and then you tell me what it means, and that's how it's going to work. Well, we can't do that. Okay, well, then I'm going to kill you. And it was very mob-like, the Babylonians. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your family. I'm going to kill your neighbors. You're going to wake up with the head of your horse in bed with you. You're going to, that's how they ruled. He was going to kill them and everybody they knew if they couldn't interpret the dream. So the guards came to arrest Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't even do anything. Like, what are you arresting us for? Well, King had a dream. Daniel said, wait a second. I can't interpret this, but God can. He immediately, before he even started, he said, let my God do the work. And so they prayed about it, and he came to the king and he said, King Nebuchadnezzar, here's your dream. You had a dream of a great statue, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, torso of brass, legs of bronze, feet mixed with iron, feet mixed with iron and clay. Then a giant stone came down, a stone not made by hands, came down, shattered the statue. The stone became a great mountain, which was over all the kingdoms of the earth. Nebuchadnezzar goes, yeah, that was my dream. And then he goes on to interpret it. The head is Babylon, arms and chest of silver is the Persian Empire. The next, bronze, would be the Greek Empire. The legs would be the Roman Empire. The feet of clay would be when the Roman Empire divided into the different European nations. The stone was, of course, Christ, setting up his eternal kingdom, the church. That's a quick overview of that. That's really snap. So he interpreted it. The king said, okay, from now on, Daniel is the prime minister over all of Babylon and the chief of the Magi. In Daniel 5, after Nebuchadnezzar's death, they were telling Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, about Daniel. He said, "There's a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the soothsayers, priests, sorcerers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit of knowledge and insight and interpretation of dreams, explanation of riddles, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel." That was their description of Daniel. That's how they described this guy as having so much spiritual insight and practical wisdom that the king had made him the chief over all of the Magi in the kingdom. Now, Daniel, being a Jew, would have educated them in all the ancient Jewish prophecies. He ruled over the Magi for 64 years. Do you think in 64 years he could have told them a little bit about the God of Israel? Like, dude, why are you more powerful than us? Why are you more powerful than all of the gods? Why is your spirit, because they refer to it as the gods, why is your spirit more powerful than the spirit of the gods? Well, it's because it's the one true God. He would have told them the prophecies of Isaiah, the prophecies of Micah, of Jeremiah, of possibly Ezekiel, because they were contemporaries. They were in Babylon at the same time. But he would have told them the prophecies of Moses. And when God gave him a dream and a prophecy, he would have explained the interpretation to his students, to his disciples. They would have known, and for 64 years they studied under Daniel. He would have been known as the great one, basically. We see in Daniel 9, he was praying for a prophecy of when God was going to release Israel from captivity. Daniel 9, I'm going to start in verse 20. I think I said 21 on the bulletin, but I'm starting in verse 20. "While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel," there's a key, just throwing that out there for free, "presenting my plea before God, my God, on behalf of the holy mountain of my God." Verse 21, "While I was still speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness, about the time of the evening offering. And he instructed me and talked with me and said, 'Daniel, I have come now to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your pleas, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, because you are highly esteemed. So pay attention to the message and gain understanding of the vision.'" Verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the wrongdoing and to make an end of sin, to make an atonement for guilt and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know the understanding that from the issuing of a decree, this is important, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah, the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with the streets and moat, even in the times of distress. And then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are returned. Now, that's crazy. That's just crazy talk. Until you start digging into it. What does it mean 70 weeks? It has taken a lot of reading and listening to a lot of lectures, most of them hours long, as to why they determine that the weeks mean years. There are several references in the Old Testament and in the book of Revelation determining that the weeks actually refer to years. So the 70 weeks is referring to weeks of years. It talks about that when the 7 Sabbaths are completed. in some of the prophecies, what that meant was 7 years. Sabbaths of years. What it says when they were completed, referring to the weeks being years. So, 70 weeks would be 70 years or weeks of years. And he says, from the beginning of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 7 plus 62 is 69. Okay? First 7 years were when, well, first of all, King Artaxerxes was the one that gave the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Cyrus sent them back to rebuild the temple. Then Artaxerxes said, okay, finish rebuilding the temple. It wasn't until 444 BC that Artaxerxes says, now go build Jerusalem. Nehemiah, read the book of Nehemiah. In 444 BC, he gave the decree to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. From when Nehemiah went back to rebuild Jerusalem and then returned to Persia, there's your 7 years. It says 7 plus 62. That's where you get 69. 69, here's where it gets fun. You got to dig for this one. 69 times the 7 is 483 years. We're looking at 483 years from the declaration of Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem till the coming of Messiah. So stay with me. You add that together, you actually land at 39 AD. What happened at 39 AD? That was past Christ. Unless you use the ancient Babylonian calendar. Babylon, Arabia, China, India, all of the Middle and Far East used a 360-day calendar. We cannot go by our American 365 days. 360-day calendar, you go by the days times the 69 years, plus the day that it gave. I always thought it was weird that Nehemiah actually gave the day that he went back to Jerusalem to rebuild it. To the day. You take that 369 years, or 483 years, multiply it by the days of 360, not 65, you land at 32 AD. More specifically, you land on the 8th of the month of Nisan, which specifically was the day of the triumphal entry. Your math, if you take it from the day, and that's why it's so cool that Nehemiah actually mentioned what day of the month it was. He mentioned the day of the month that Artaxerxes says, you go rebuild Jerusalem. He mentioned it to the day. You take 360-day years, multiply that times 483, you land on the day of the triumphal entry. Tell me that's not specific. Tell me God doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, God has it to the day. And he said, this is what the Messiah is going to do. He's going to make an end of sin. He's going to make an atonement for guilt. And he's going to bring about everlasting righteousness. That's what the Magi knew. The Magi who studied under Daniel knew that there would be a Messiah coming in 483 years. He would bring in a righteous kingdom. He would make an atonement for sin, make an end of sin, and then it says, after that time, the Messiah will be cut off, meaning he will be killed. They knew the Messiah was going to be killed. Didn't know everything about it. They knew that it would be destroyed. It said after that, the city would be destroyed and the sanctuary. What happened in 70 AD? Titus came in, completely destroyed the temple, completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem. The sacrificial system stopped right then. There's no more temple. There's never been another sacrificial lamb made after 70 AD because there was no temple. The Magi knew this. The Magi knew this is what Daniel said. This is what was prophesied. This is what we need to be looking for. So we know that they stayed in with these prophecies. We know that even though Jews were allowed to go back. Some of them stayed behind in prominent positions, namely Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. We got Esther. We got Mordecai. Remember the book of Esther? Mordecai was exalted to number 2 in Persia. Remember that? All the Jews that stayed behind were in areas of prominence. Persia became partly converted to Judaism. How do I know that? Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, which was a huge Jewish feast, 50 days after the Passover, it says there were people there from all around the world. God-fearing Gentiles had come from Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Iran. The first 4 places mentioned are in modern-day Iran, which was ancient Persia. Why were the Iranians in Jerusalem to celebrate the feasts? That is proof that the people there, many of them had held on to the God of Daniel, to the God of Israel. And after they had gone back, they still held on to it. They were still following and converting to Judaism. So these magi, they were looking for that. And when they saw a sign, when they saw the star appear before them, wow! This is it. This is the star. So they get their entourage together because they had been looking for this for over 4 centuries. They were in the time that every single magi before them wished they were there for. They got together. It doesn't say there was 3 of them. It says there were 3 gifts. They thought it was a king. So they didn't come with enough for a carpenter. They went to Jerusalem thinking they were going to meet a king. They walked in, it said they were saying as they were going. That's what the word they were saying, where is he born of the king of the Jews? It's like they were going in and going, hey, have you heard about the king? Where's the king of the Jews born? Where's he that's born king of the Jews? It was a constant questioning as they were coming into the city. Where is the king of the Jews? Herod flipped out. Why? Because he was not born king of anything. He was not even Jewish. So someone who was born king of the Jews was a threat to him. It says Herod was troubled and all of Jerusalem with him. Why? Because when Herod came unhinged, people died. That's how Herod was. He killed his own sons, his own wife, his own mother-in-law, just because he suspected they might want to take over. Herod, when he came unhinged, people died. So when these guys, these magi, were walking in, these kingmakers saying, hey, where's the king of the Jews born? I'm going to get out of town quickly before Herod loses it. He was getting to the end of his life. We know from Josephus that he had kidney failure. He had probably syphilis, gout, infections. The guy was dying a very horrible, painful death. And it messed with his head. So his level of insanity was elevated. And these magi came into the city. Where is he born of King of the Jews? They had come to worship him. Not only did they know who they were talking about, but Herod knew it was the Messiah. This wasn't just a normal baby, because when he called the rulers, he said, hey, where does it say that the Messiah is going to be born? Not when's the next king. He knew it was the Messiah. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just some random baby boy that he was jealous of. Herod said, where's the Messiah going to be born? All the priests and scribes came in and said, well, in Micah, Bethlehem of Judea. They knew. Why did the priests and scribes not jump on the bandwagon with the Magi? Fear? Fear, maybe comfort. They had their jobs. They had their places established. They were political. They were set up there. They were not the real priests. They were set up there as political puppets for Herod. They were comfortable where they were. But the scribes knew the scripture. The scribes would memorize the passages. And when the Magi came in and said, hey, where's the king of the Jews going to be born? Because we've seen his star in the east. The scribes went, Numbers 24. Numbers 24, the prophecy. I see him, but he is not here. He is coming. A star will rise out of Judea, and a scepter will rise out of Israel. The prophecy of Numbers 24. When they walk in and say, we've seen the star of the king of Israel, the scribes knew exactly what they were talking about. Herod knew exactly who they were talking about, but the Gentiles went and bowed before the king. And those who knew more than them stayed where they were. Because of fear, because they were comfortable, because they didn't want to give up what they had for God. And my question is this. We hear about Jesus. We hear about the Messiah. We hear about the King of Kings who's come to save us, to give his life. Just like the prophecy said, he will make an atonement for guilt. He will wash away our sin. It was in the prophecy. That's what he was coming for. And the Magi came in and said, hey, we brought enough treasure for a king. We came to Jerusalem first. We didn't know we were going to be in Bethlehem, but here you go. Joseph was instantly loaded. I mean, they had done all this treasure on him, and it says they fell down and worshipped him. Prostrate before him, they turned the floor of that little house in Bethlehem into a kissing ground. They were on their faces before the King of Kings. They laid their treasures at his feet, and they worshiped him. My question for us is, when we know who the King of Kings is, will we lay our treasure at his feet? Will we say, you know what? I'm going to put this behind me. I don't care about fear. I don't care what other people think. I don't care what I have about my position. Am I going to respond like the Magi and say, I'm going to fall down and worship God? I'll lay my treasure before him and leave with the treasure of heaven in my heart. That's what it comes down to. Are you going to lay your treasure to him and leave with the treasure of heaven in your heart? Or are we going to hang on to what we got and say, no, I'm fine. I'm comfortable. I'm good. Okay, I'll get saved. I'll get saved. But I'm not gonna surrender anything I got to God, because it's mine and I worked for it. This is my position. Think of those priests. Think of the scribes, the Levites. They knew who Jesus was before the Magi did. And yet they didn't respond. My question to you is this. God has revealed himself to you. He sent his son, his only son, to be born, to live as a man, to represent man before a holy God. Only a man could represent mankind before a holy God. Only a man could be sacrificed on behalf of mankind. But only a God could be perfect enough to be that sacrifice. So he sent Jesus to be our sacrifice. He's revealed that to us, and he invites us. Will you receive the free gift of eternal life? My son paid for it. You don't have to work for it. You don't have to do anything. I'm going to call the praise team. What's going to keep us? What's going to keep us from saying, hey, I see this. I know this. I have the head knowledge that God sent his son. I see the prophecies and scriptures all the way down to the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem as king. Down to the day. I can see that and go, man, look at that. Isn't God cool? He got it right. He got it down to the day. Or are we going to say like the Magi, you know what? I may not understand everything, but I'm going to worship you. I'm going to turn your presence into my worshiping ground. I'm going to turn wherever we are, whether it's in a palace or in a house, in a church, I'm going to turn your presence into my worshiping ground. I will turn my treasures over to you. I will turn whatever it has, Lord, and I will say, God, you paid the price for my salvation, and I receive that. Or are we going to walk away and say, you know what? I don't need this. I got better off with that. Like the priests, like the scribes. Think about that. What's your response going to be? Are we going to say, God, I respond to you, or God, I hold on to me? Let's worship him. Let's adore him.